And now I want to invite our next speaker. Is Alexandre Champagne. I hope I pronounce it correctly. Hello, Alexandre.
Hi, do you hear me?
Yeah, we hear you. We see you. Our next speaker is from University of Montreal, and we listen the presentation about mutation favor the emergence of cooperation. Are you ready, Alexandre?
I am. Thank you very much.
Okay, we can start. Thank you.
Okay, excellent. So in my talk today, I'll present some interesting conclusions derived from our work on numerical simulations concerning the cooperation phenomena in the context of the origin of life. So let me first start by my conclusion slide so you know right away where we're headed. We can draw two main conclusions from our simulations. The first one is that in our model, cooperation seems to emerge readily and robustly. Now, you might wonder what this has to do with the origin of life. Well, as I'll explain in a second, many origin of life theories assume some form of cooperation, be it biochemical, for instance, where simple molecules will be able to build onto more complex ones. So if cooperation emerges easily, our conclusion for origin of life researchers is that life could also emerge maybe much more easily than we currently think. And in other words, this is a statement on the propensity for life to emerge. So life could be ubiquitous in the universe, and this is, of course, an exciting idea. Now, there is a correlator to that conclusion, this time for astrobiologists and exoplanet researchers, so people that actually do the searching. This might mean that our concept of the habitable zone, so traditionally defined as the region around a star where a planet with an atmosphere similar to that of Earth can sustain liquid water, could be too restrictive. If life appears easily and is resilient, then that could mean that we could find life in many places that don't fit into this definition of the habitable zone. So in other words, we could have to rethink our conception of habitability, as it might appear that some of its presuppositions could be too restrictive. So I think the first thing to note here is how exactly cooperation is related to the origin of life. Now, there's this excellent paper by Paul Higgs from the University of McMaster that describes very precisely how cooperation is involved in origin of life models. Let me quickly give you two examples. First, in RNA world theory, we make the hypothesis that ribozymes could have replicated in the early moments of life, which means that, for instance, one ribozyme must have taken another ribozyme as its template strand and replicated it without payback. So this is actually a first form of cooperation. Now, another theory that is highly popular in origin of life community is those so-called autocatalytic sets. Well, the same principle applies here. If you have a molecule of some kind of prebiotic entity that catalyzes the production of another entity, ultimately leading to an autocatalytic set, this is also a form of cooperation. One thing that I was going to say that one thing is very important to note here is that we often talk about cooperation in terms of conscious behavior or decision. So, well, you can see that we can have cooperation phenomena in nature that absolutely do not require any conscious agency and that still qualify as cooperation phenomena, which actually leads us to my next slide, which is about the prisoner's dilemma. So the model we have built is actually itself built on a model in game theory called the prisoner's dilemma. When I told you that cooperation does not require any conscious decision-making, well, this is exactly the kind of phenomena that the PD allows us to examine. It is defined through the matrix shown on the left on my slide, but in a nutshell, it's the following. Two players can choose to cooperate. If they both cooperate, they get an intermediate score. But if one wants to cooperate but not the other player who defected gains the maximum score, while the player who wanted to cooperate has 0 points. Meanwhile, if the two players defect, they will each get a non-zero but minimal score. Now, this creates a dilemma because the most advantageous move is, of course, to try to exploit the opponent, hope he wants to defect, and then he wants to cooperate, and then you defect. But if everyone adopts this strategy, well, nobody wins. So either you successfully exploit the other player, or you accept to mutually cooperate, which leads to everyone having an intermediate score. So this is precisely why it's a dilemma. Now, I won't go into the details, but this game theory model has successfully been applied to the microbiological world in a lab setting to analyze cooperation phenomena and interaction between viruses and bacteria. So it is a valid framework that we can apply to study biology on small scales and consequently to examine the origin of life. Now, a further extension of the PD is called the iterated prisoner's dilemma. Basically, you simply repeat the dilemma a definite number of times while the moves are defined by a strategy. Simple strategies are possible. For example, you can always cooperate, always defect, display reciprocal cooperation. So the strategy is actually called tit for tat. So you start by cooperating and then you do the same move as your opponent did at the last turn, or you can just decide to play randomly. Now we simply count the total score for each of the two strategies playing together, and the winner of the IPD game is the strategy with the highest score. So now let's get into the central piece of my presentation. The model we used is defined on a lattice. We distribute those strategies on the lattice, and then we let every strategy play against every other strategy in what we call its more neighborhood. So the 8 sites surrounding them, and then we count the scores of each players in the game. Then at the next iteration of the model, we scan the lattice, and for each site, we replace its strategy if there was a higher scoring strategy in its more neighborhood. So this way, we get an evolutionary dynamics on the lattice where the most successful strategies are propagated, and this creates a complex evolution over time. So let me just show you a couple of examples of the dynamics that we get in those simulations. Of course, I don't have the time to go into the details, but just to mention that we get multiple interesting phenomena with a simple model. We can get, for example, Fisher waves. We can get diffusion-like behavior. We can get phenomena that looks like invasions on the lattice. So with that very simple model, we actually get very complicated dynamics. So now that I've exposed the dynamics of the model, normally in the prisoner's dilemma, the Nash equilibrium, so the optimal position of the game is to defect. So that is the most advantageous behavior for any strategy is to always defect towards its opponent. What we wanted to analyze using this model is under which conditions could cooperative behavior emerge spontaneously. Now, one thing that for sure characterizes prebiotic environments is that they're stochastic. We might have had volcanic activity, cosmic radiation, all sorts of things that tend to perturb a system, of course. So what we first included on our model is an error rate. So the strategies playing together reversed their moves with a probability P. So first of all, we have created a large number of simulations for different values of P, ranging from a few errors per simulation to making errors almost 100% of the time. And we have found that cooperative strategies, for example, tit for tat, which is shown in blue here, and always cooperate, which is shown in green, could be more or less successful for some values of this error rate. Now, since our goal is to study the emergence of cooperation in origin of life scenarios, we then included the heritability of the error rate. That is, when a strategy was replaced by another strategy, we also made the error rate of the replacing strategy heritable. We again ran a number of simulations and found that cooperation was somewhat higher in those simulations. And finally, what we did was to include mutations in the simulation. When a strategy was replaced, a small random correction was applied to the error rate, which caused the error rate to be either a bit higher or lower than before. This time again, we could see that cooperation, mostly through the strategy tit for tat, was even higher. So we can summarize this by the following. Adding heritability in the system favors cooperation, and adding mutations favors it even more. Now, what we wanted to analyze further this tendency of cooperation to increase in the system by adding the heritability and mutations of the error rate. We hence ran simulations for a wide range of mutation rates. And what we found was really interesting. As we increased this error rate, always defect strategies, which can be related to, for instance, parasites in a biological system, since their only behavior is to continually exploit other strategies, mostly disappeared from the lattice, while the tit-for-tat strategy, which is a cooperative strategy, completely invaded the lattice. So that means that as we increased the mutation rate, cooperative phenomena spontaneously emerged in the system. And this was a robust domination since all the simulations ended with a lattice completely invaded by tit for tat. One interesting we can notice in our simulations is that we get the analog of Huygens error catastrophe, which is actually a well-known phenomenon for self-reproducing systems. Another very interesting feature is that this transition reminds us also of a phase transition phenomena in physics. The origin of life has in fact many times been related to a phase transition phenomena, and this is also what our model suggests. We observe a sudden change in the model behavior for some critical regions of the mutation rate. So this suggests that a transition could very well be properly analyzed through statistical physics. And now this transition towards cooperation happens concurrently as a tendency for the mean error rate to get smaller and smaller for tit for tat. This makes sense in that tit for tat lacks any error correction mechanism. If you have, for instance, two tit for tat strategies cooperating together, if one strategy makes a mistake, then the two strategies will defect indefinitely. So the less mistakes TFT does, the more successful it is. And here in the system, it lowers its mean error rate through evolutionary means, which is part of the mechanism allowing it to take over the whole lattice. And finally, we again notice in the evolution of those error rates, large fluctuations of the mean error rate in the critical region, which is another feature of phase transition phenomena that I just noted. I'm sorry?
We have 3 minutes.
Okay, I do not hear you very well, but I think there's 3 minutes left. I'm almost finished with my presentation. So one important thing to note is that spatiality plays a central role in our model. If we randomize the lattice so that instead of playing with strategies inside their more neighborhood, the strategies get to play with another random strategy anywhere else on the grid, well, this effectively destroys any spatial dynamics that we've observed previously, and more importantly, prevents this emergence cooperation that we've seen. This agrees with something people have suspected for a very long time in biology, that the media itself matters when forming complex structures. So ultimately, our conclusion that cooperation and maybe also life appears more readily than previously thought, in fact, agrees with many ideas already proposed by origin of life researchers. For instance, some have suggested that an early appearance of life on Earth in those so-called warm little ponds within a few million years after the Earth started to become habitable. And our results would then partly explain this early appearance of life on Earth. Also, the observed resilience of life on Earth. So life has survived many dramatic extinction events and can survive in extreme environments. Well, again, our simulations completely agree with this view. If cooperation is robust, life could also be a very robust phenomenon. Now, the logical consequence of life being resilient and appearing easily is direct for astrobiology. This means that our habitable zone, which is, as I said, traditionally defined as the region around a star where liquid water can be sustained, could be too restrictive. Some research actually suggests that life can be partly held responsible for making the Earth habitable. So we could suppose that if life was to appear outside of the habitable zone, then it could participate itself in terraforming the ecosystem. So we might have to rethink how we focus our search for life. Maybe life could also emerge on violent environments, such as around M dwarfs with intense radiation. And this has to be kept in mind when searching for life elsewhere in the universe. So now let me get back to my initial conclusion. What we have shown using our simple model is that cooperative behavior can emerge easily and robustly in an evolutionary scenario, which could also mean that biochemical cooperation typical of the origin of life could also emerge easily. And consequently, if life emerges more easily than we thought, we might have to broaden our search for life because focusing only on the habitable zone as currently defined might be overly restrictive. So thank you for listening. I know there was a lot of stuff in a quick amount of time, so don't hesitate if you have any questions.
Okay, thank you, Alexandre, for your interesting speak for your interesting talk. Sorry, I see the question from Tomek. Eigen paradox. Could you tell us more about it?
Eigen paradox?
Yes.
I'm not sure that I haven't mentioned that in my presentation. I haven't seen that term.
Tomek, can you explain us something more about it? Because I must to say that I also don't know what is it. Right before fast transition. This is the
oh, the eigen para. Oh, sorry, I went quickly over that. Hold on a second. I'm gonna go back to my slides. Okay, the eigen error threshold. So this is actually something we have observed in our model. And the behavior in biological systems is actually pretty similar. So that was quite a discovery for us in our numerical simulations. So as we increase, so here you have the mutation, so the fraction of populations for each of the strategies as a function of the mutation rate. So as you increase the mutation rate in the system, you see that cooperation increases because TFT populations increase. But as you approach some critical value of the mutation rate, some very, very high value of the mutation rate, what happens now is that basically all the strategies all the dynamics of the model starts to break down, and all the strategies start to do pretty much what they want. So they start to make a lot of mistakes. So we find ourselves with a model that doesn't support cooperation anymore. So actually, this phenomenon pretty much looks like what we observe in biology, which is called the Eigen's error threshold, which is actually the maximum amount of information a biological or a self-replicating system can sustain. If you go past some mutation threshold in self-replicating systems, then the system cannot support anymore that mutation rate and starts to break down. So information cannot be propagated anymore in the self-replicating system. So this is a feature that was theorized by Eigen in the 70s, so a couple of decades ago. And it's actually something we also observe in our simulations. If we increase the mutation rate to some very, very high value, well, all the dynamics of the system starts to break down, and we don't observe cooperative phenomena anymore. So there's no structure formation, there's no complexity in the model. Everything starts to break down. So this was quite a surprise for us, actually, when doing those simulations. We observe what really looks like a precise biological phenomenon in our model based on the prisoner's dilemma. So it makes us think that our model could very well be an analog for biological systems in the context of origin of life scenarios.
Thank you, Alexandre. We have next two questions, but we are very short with time. Then maybe you will try to answer to Kamil and Jacobo just on the chat, because we need to go with the next presentations. Sorry, guys, for this, but we need to go further. Thank you once again, Alexandre, for your presentation.